Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Tony. And his
All right,
wife,
everyone,
Mitzi.
thanks for coming.
His wife, Mitzi.
A lot of Sinatra fans out there.
Yeah.
Ed O'Brien lives over in Troy. He's one of the world's experts on Frank Sinatra. He's written 5 books about Frank Sinatra. He's going to talk about this book today, Sinatra in Hollywood, by Tom Santopietro. It's one of the few books about just Frank Sinatra's film career. So he's already been telling me well, he'll tell you all about it, but he's going to be mentioning some other books too. So here's Ed O'Brien from Troy to tell us about the book.
Thank you. Thank you. I've never reviewed a book before. So I've written them, but I've never reviewed one. And I was thinking how to do this. And I thought I'd start by trying to give you an idea of who Frank Sinatra was. In the 1950s and early 60s, when he played in Vegas, or he played in Miami Beach, or he played the 500 Club, the marquee would have, "He's here." That's all. He's here. Now, if you didn't know who he was, you shouldn't be down there. And that's the kind of megastar he was, and the fascination that he had with the American people. He was so iconic. He was so huge. And Stephen Holden, the critic for the New York Times, has stated more than once that Frank Sinatra in the early 60s, was the most powerful entertainer in the history of show business, before or since. He had such power. If you angered him, you didn't work. If he wanted something, he got it. One time, he wanted to land his helicopter on the roof of a hotel in Los Angeles, so he could go down through the hotel and over to Capitol Records to record. And the hotel said no. So he bought the hotel. Then he landed the helicopter, okay? But his talent was staggering. It absolutely was staggering. There is no one who was a greater singer. When he died in 1998, every obit, the greatest singer of popular music who ever lived. That was, okay? He was also a great in-person performer. One of maybe the 2 or 3 greatest in-person performers. Does anyone here ever see him in person? Okay, you know what I'm talking about. The minute he walked out on the stage, he had the audience. He had magnetism. He had charisma, whatever word you're looking for. He had that. And he had it in abundance, absolute abundance. There was no one that could do that the way Sinatra did. Okay, and he was a very good actor. Now, I'm going to be very honest with you. Quite often, he didn't work at it. He didn't work at his acting the way he worked in his recordings or his performances on stage. It was spotty. If he found something he really liked, that he loved, he was magnificent. But if he didn't believe in it, he walked through it. And I'm sure some of you who have seen movies and you're agreeing with me right now, you've seen both. Okay? Pauline Kael, the critic for The New Yorker, the film critic, once wrote that Frank Sinatra could have been the greatest actor of all time, but instead he became Frank Sinatra, all in uppercase. And it's true. He became Frank Sinatra, and becoming Frank Sinatra, he was Frank Sinatra. You can't do a film like, I don't know if anyone here saw The Visitor this last year with Richard Jenkins. Okay, he was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor. He becomes the character. Frank Sinatra couldn't become the character, not for us in the theater. He was always Frank Sinatra. There was no way around that. If you were sitting in the theater and looking, were you thinking that's Joey Evans, or that's Frankie Machine, or that's Maggio? No, it was always Frank Sinatra. You're thinking, he's really great in that role, but he's Frank Sinatra. He couldn't get away from that. And I don't think any major star, Cary Grant couldn't, or Humphrey Bogart, or Bette Davis, you knew who they were. And that was one of the problems. He had 44 lead roles in films, starting in 1943 up to 1980. In all, he appeared in 69 films. The wasted talent quite often was because he didn't want to do what he should have been doing, and he drove directors crazy. One of the people that worked with him that I've interviewed, a tremendous number of people who have worked with Frank Sinatra through the years, both the recordings and the films. And he made a film in 1963, it was released in '64, called Four for Texas. And he made it for the money, because he needed the money badly because his record company was hemorrhaging on him. And $800,000 they paid him to make the movie, which was a lot of money back in 1963. Not today, but back then it was. And he walked through it. He would only do one take for every scene shot. He refused to do close-up and far away. He wanted the director to do it all in one thing, pan in on me and have the shot far away at the same time, which is almost impossible. The director, Robert Aldrich, was hospitalized twice during the filming for high blood pressure. But in the long run, it affected Sinatra, because what happened is Aldrich went on to have a lot of success. The Dirty Dozen was one of his big hits. And he went around telling the A directors, don't work with him. This guy is just, don't work with him. And it hurt him. But let's get to the positive. Mr. Santopietro, I think we're getting that right, he published 2 bios before this one on Barbra Streisand and Doris Day, and they were well received. And what he tries to do here is blend the film career of Sinatra with his private life and his controversial public persona. And it was very controversial, as we all know. He begins, and it's a wonderful beginning, with Sinatra winning the Academy Award on the night of March 25th, 1954. And Frank gets the award, and then at the end of the ceremony, everyone goes to the big parties in Hollywood. That's traditional. You go to the parties. Frank didn't do that. He went into Beverly Hills, and he walked the streets all night, alone, just alone, because he couldn't do it. He had to be alone. And what Santopietro tries to do is show that this was the essence of Sinatra. Beneath it all was a very lonely, lonely man who was solitary. And the need he had for adulation, for fame, this is what drove him. He needed to fill that void, that terrible loneliness that he had inside him. And this was what made him into Frank Sinatra. And that's how he begins. And he cites this, and he makes the point that Sinatra could never outrun this loneliness, even despite the fact that he had great fame, he had success beyond anyone's wildest dreams. He still couldn't do it. Then he begins with the films. And the first one that Sinatra did was in 1935. He did 3 small shorts for Major Bowes. Now, Sinatra was on Major Bowes, and he won the amateur contest there. And they toured, and they toured all over the country. And while they were touring, they shot these, they did them. And he did the 3 shorts, and they showed them in theaters. He didn't work again until 1940, when he was with Dorsey. And he's with Tommy Dorsey. I'm assuming everyone knows sort of this stuff, and I don't have to do that. If you have questions, just ask me. But when he's with Dorsey, the first film is Las Vegas Nights. It's filmed in November and December of 1940. And I have the sheet, the worksheet for the recordings, the pre-recording they did for the film. And it says next to Sinatra, boy singer. That's all it says. Okay? He was paid the astonishing amount of $15 a day to do this. Now, I interviewed Joe Stafford. And Joe Stafford was also with Dorsey at the time, and she was one of the Pied Pipers. And she told me they were playing the Hollywood Palladium. They did 3 shows a night. The last show was at 2 o'clock in the morning. Then they would go over to the Paramount studio to film Las Vegas Nights. And Joe told me, she said, I could not stay awake. I'd be sitting there in makeup, and the next thing I'd know, the guy would wake her up and say, you got to get out there. And she said it was a nightmare. And she said she never watched the movie. She never had seen the movie, never wanted to see the movie, because she said it was just such a terrible, terrible experience for her. But that was the beginning for Sinatra. The next year, he made a movie called, the original title was I'll Take Manila. And while they were filming it, the Japanese overran the Philippines. So they decided that's a bad title. That's really a bad title. So they changed it to Ship Ahoy. And Ship Ahoy starred Eleanor Powell and Red Skelton. And Sinatra has two great scenes in it. He sings a song called The Last Call for Love and Poor You. And he's really spotlighted. It's marvelous. Then he did a film where he's only in for one scene called Reveille with Beverly with Ann Miller. And she introduces all these acts, Count Basie and Duke Ellington and Frank. And Frank comes on, and they got 6 pianos. And Frank's all dressed in a tuxedo, and he's about this big. Earlier, Joe and I were talking about how thin he had a 28-inch waist, okay? And he does Night and Day, the Cole Porter song, a big, big production number of Cole Porter. Then, of course, the Paramount Theater, December 30th, 1942. Jack Benny, as a favor to Benny Goodman, introduces Frank Sinatra. And Frank Sinatra walks out on the stage of the Paramount Theater, and I can't repeat what Benny Goodman said, but he said, "What the blank was that?" Okay? And that was the beginning. That was the Bobby Soxer thing. He signed with RKO, and his first film was Higher and Higher. He liked to say later on, and my career from then on went lower and lower. But that was his first film with RKO, and it starred Michelle Morgan and what's his name? Frank McHugh. And he made that, and then he did Step Lively, which was a remake of the Marx Brothers film Room Service. And the great thing about those films, the saving grace really, is the music. He had wonderful people writing the music for him. His friends, Sammy Cahn and Julie Stein, and they did these marvelous, marvelous songs. And Sinatra, he's just great with the singing. The movies, no, they're not that great. But then he signed with MGM. And when he was with MGM, he started with Anchors Aweigh. His co-star is Gene Kelly. And Gene Kelly says, "Frank, you got to learn to dance, because they have dance scenes." And Sinatra doesn't know what to do. How am I going to do this? Have anyone here seen Anchors Aweigh? Okay, there's a famous scene in it where they have I Begged Her. And they're on the beds, and they're jumping back and forth on the beds, dancing. 72 takes over a period of a week. Sinatra had blisters on his feet. He was exhausted, but Kelly was an absolute perfectionist. You're not going to do this unless we get it right. 72 takes. The movie's a huge hit. A huge hit. Sinatra, again, it's Julie Stein and Sammy Cahn. They write beautiful songs for him. The best song of all, I Fall in Love Too Easily. Sinatra is sitting in the Hollywood Bowl playing a piano and singing that song. Of course, they're all pre-recorded. And you have some of the sheets there. They're from MGM, and there's some of the pre-recordings that he did. I have all of them. And there was a big hit. Was nominated for Best Picture, and Kelly was nominated for Best Actor, and the song was nominated, I Fall in Love Too Easily. Then Sinatra, they put him in a movie that is one of the most bizarre performances of his career. It was the tribute to Jerome Kern's, Till the Clouds Roll By. And at the end of the film, Frank comes up out of the clouds, dressed in a white suit. Anyone know what I'm talking about? And sings Old Man River. It has to be seen to be believed. Okay, it's infamous. But for some reason they did it, and he agreed to do it, and that was it. Then he did It Happened in Brooklyn with Jimmy Durante, Katherine Grayson, and Peter Lawford. Again, wonderful songs written by Stein and Cahn. Time After Time, It's the Same Old Dream, I Believe, Brooklyn Bridge. They just gave him great songs. Then he angered Louis B. Mayer, who owned MGM. So they gave him The Kissing Bandit. In The Kissing Bandit, Frank once said to his daughter, "Don't ever let my grandchildren see this film. Never. I don't want my grandchildren to see this movie." It's a disaster. I mean, but again, he sings. And it's got the lavish MGM Technicolor, so it's not terrible. And then his final film in MGM was On the Town, which is one of the best movies he ever made. It was filmed on location in New York City. It's got the wonderful Leonard Bernstein, Betty Comden, Alof Green music, and they're wonderful. The opening scene, they come down off the ship and they sing New York, New York, it's a wonderful town. And it's just fabulous. And I just wanted to cover that because that was the MGM years. And the plots were silly. Frank was always a naive, shy boy who always fell in love with the wrong girl and then at the last minute saw the girl he really loved. But the music is wonderful. The music in those films make it worthwhile and still make it worthwhile because he had an angelic voice. An absolutely angelic voice. If you talk to some film critics, talk to some music critics, they will tell you that they prefer that Sinatra to any other because he did project that innocence. He had that wonderful sense of innocence in his portrayal. And Santopietro covers that. He does a good job. He does a very good job. I admire that part of it. Then the career collapsed. Sinatra lost everything. He lost his film contract in 1950 to MGM. He lost his radio shows. He lost his television show. And he was going around doing concerts, and he wasn't even playing to half a house. He was finished. And there were articles about him. He's a has-been. He had done this because of his personal life and the way he was living his life. He left his wife and his 3 children, and he chased a goddess. And she was a goddess, Ava Gardner. And he chased her all over the world. I've interviewed Mitch Miller, and Mitch Miller has given me in great detail, meeting Frank at the airport. And Frank had just come back from Africa. Frank can barely stand up, and they're going into a recording studio. And Miller said it was terrible. It was a nightmare. So what was he going to do? He had nothing going. And he read the book From Here to Eternity. And he immediately identified with Maggio. I've got to have that role. But Harry Cohen, owned Columbia Pictures, said, who the hell wants a crooner doing a dramatic role? We don't want that. So Eli Wallach, very, very good actor, was the pick. They wanted him to play the role. Sinatra still insisted and managed to convince them to let him do a screen test. Did the screen test. Cohen still wanted Eli Wallach. But Tennessee Williams had just written a play that he was going to open on Broadway. And he said to Wallach, I want you. And Wallach made the choice between 8 weeks of filming From Here to Eternity and a long-run Tennessee Williams play on Broadway. It was a no-brainer for Wallach. He went with the Tennessee Williams. Then Ava Gardner went to see Harry Cohen. And she said, I want you to give it to Frank. Frank will do it for $1,000 a week. 8 weeks, $8,000. Harry Cohen said, he's got it. So they go to Hawaii, and Frank films it. Well, in that time frame, he was doing everything he could to resuscitate the career. And at the same time that he did this, he was signed by Capitol Records. Now, I interviewed the man who signed him, who ran Capitol, Alan Livingston. Frank came to Capitol with hat in hand. He said he was the meekest man you'd ever want to meet in your life. He wanted that contract. He wanted to have a chance. First session was April 2nd of 1953. He insisted on bringing his old arranger, Axel Stordahl, and he tried to convince him to work with this other guy, but he wouldn't do it. He said, no, I want Axel. I got to have Axel. So he did the session. At the end of that month, he was supposed to do a session with Billy May, and Billy May couldn't do it. Billy May had previous contractual obligation. So May asked his friend if he would do the session instead. The friend's name was Nelson Riddle. And Nelson Riddle came in and did that session. He did 2 May songs and wrote them like May would write the songs. And he did 2 of his own. They were called I've Got the World on a String and Don't Worry About Me. And Sinatra recorded them. Sinatra was going around the studio slapping everybody on the back, saying, I'm back, I'm back. He knew. he could not believe how great Nelson Riddle was. At the same time, he had signed, after Eternity had come out to rave reviews, he had signed to be in a movie called Pink Tights with Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was very big at the time, and it was a 20th Century Fox film, and it was all set to go. On December 15th, 1953, Frank is there on the set, ready to film. And Marilyn didn't show up. No Marilyn. She was unhappy with 20th Century. Joltin' Joe DiMaggio did not want her leaving the house. He wanted Marilyn to stay with him. And the movie never happened. So he quickly did a film called Suddenly. It's a little film. It's one of the greatest performances Sinatra ever gave. In that time frame, and Santopietro covers this very well in here, from 1953 through 1958, those 6 years, Sinatra did 17 films. And he covered the gamut of the genres. He did drama, he did musicals, and he did comedy. And he did great films. After Suddenly, he did Young at Heart with Doris Day. Then he did The Man with the Golden Arm with Otto Preminger. Guys and Dolls with Marlon Brando and Gene Simmons. High Society with Bing Crosby and Grace Kelly. The Pal Joey with Rita Hayworth and Kim Novak. The Joker is Wild, the story of Joey Lewis. Some Came Running with Vincent Minnelli as the director. He had this golden period. And at the same time, he had a golden period as a recording artist. This was the great period for Sinatra. He did all those fabulous, fabulous albums at Capitol with Nelson Riddle. And those albums are timeless. They're just simply timeless. Now, I interviewed his valet, George Jacobs, and he told me that contrary to what everybody believed about Frank Sinatra, Sinatra was not the swinger that everyone thought he was back then. He said he would be home almost every night, and he would work on the albums, and he would work on every nuance, every shading, every tone to get it perfect. He'd have his piano player over, Bill Miller. He'd sit there and he'd go over it. If something wasn't right, he'd call Nelson Riddle. Riddle would come over and they'd fix it. And it shows in every one of those albums because they're perfect. They really are. And it's because he worked so hard and he was such a professional. At the same time, he was doing the same thing with his movies. And Jacobs told me he would just learn his lines and learn them. The Man with the Golden Arm, he did take after take after take. And he was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actor. He has always said that was his best performance. Okay? It's one of his best performances. I don't know if it's his best, but it certainly is one of his best performances. And he continued doing this, movie after movie, through the late 50s. Then, I don't know exactly what happened. He lost a lot of his professionalism because he became so powerful. He had so much going. He had so many things to do. He was recording. He was producing. He was in movies. He was making albums. He was doing concerts. And he was also trying to expand his enterprise, Sinatra Enterprises. He was doing everything. And he started to do things not quite as well as what he had done before, and especially in his movies. He didn't like the movie. He was Pride and the Passion. I was telling this to Joe earlier. The Pride and the Passion in 1957, they're filming it in Spain. He's starring with Cary Grant and Sophia Loren. Okay? And Sunday afternoon, he goes over and he visits Stanley Kramer, the director, and he said, Stanley, whether we finish the movie or not, I'm leaving on Thursday. And Kramer said, you're what? He said, I'm leaving on Thursday if you're not. And Kramer said, Frank, we got 7 more weeks to film. And Sinatra said, I'm going. And on Thursday, he was gone. 7 weeks. Well, what they had to do a few months later is build a set on a back lot in Hollywood and try to recreate Spain. It didn't really work. But Frank didn't like the movie. He didn't like the delays in the production, so he left. And that's how he was. Okay, and this started to become more and more of a problem as you got into the 1960s with his movies. When he found something he believed in, he found something he really admired and loved, the Manchurian Candidate. He was magnificent. And that, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, what do you think would be the film that would be the film of Sinatra's for his career, I would have said From Here to Eternity. But that's not true anymore. I think the one that's holding up better and is becoming the movie is The Manchurian Candidate. It has a cult following. It is a film that is a wonderful satire, black humor, and it has terrific performances by everybody. Sinatra as Ben Marco is wonderful, but Lawrence Harvey is terrific. Angela Lansbury. Angela Lansbury was 37 years old, and she played Lawrence Harvey's mother. And Lawrence Harvey was 36. Okay, and she got an Academy Award nomination for it. All right, that's how good it was. And the next year he did Come Blow Your Horn, which is it's a good film. Neil Simon, and he was good in that. Lee J. Cobb is in it with him, Barbara Rush, Molly Pecan, and he also sings a song. But you could see that he was losing interest. He still was a magnificent recording artist. Going into a studio, recording an album, the concert Sinatra or Sinatra Basie or whatever he was doing, but he didn't bring that same professionalism to his roles in films. It was becoming less. He still could do it. Von Ryan's Express, 1965. His co-star is Trevor Howard. Howard lets him know very early on, this is going to be a good movie, Frank, and we're going to work really hard. Sinatra takes the challenge. It becomes a very good movie, an excellent film, a big box office hit, and it gets rave reviews. Trevor Howard. When Sinatra had a really good director, where he had a co-star that challenged him, it was a different story. On the Town, 1949. He became bored with all the time it took in New York to set everything up, to do a scene. So he started showing up late, or he wouldn't show up at all. And Gene Kelly went to him. Gene Kelly was the co-director with Stanley Donen. And he said, Frank, we're not going to do this. And Sinatra right away backed off and agreed to be there because it was Gene Kelly. And he admired and respected him so much that he wouldn't do that. But when he got a director he didn't respect, or he had a movie he didn't believe in, it was a different story. And that, what I'm trying to say is he had sort of a checkered career when it came to his films. The whole idea, and Santopietro makes this point, he believed that his best performance was the first take. And he proceeded to do that a great deal of the time. It was not fair, quite often, to the other performers, because they didn't always get it on the first take, and they wanted to do a second, third take. Frank wouldn't do a second or third take. He did one take. And he makes the point, the author makes the point, and it's a good one. If you look at some of the finest films Sinatra did, Anchors Away, From Here to Eternity, The Man with the Golden Arm, he did numerous takes. He worked very hard because of the situation he was in, the people he was working with, and they are the finest films that he did. They really are. They are magnificent films. So it doesn't really hold water when he talks about, he can only do it on one take. I was telling Joe earlier, in 1955, he was a star of Our Town on NBC, Producer's Showcase, and there was a musical adaptation of Thornton Wilder's play. Frank never showed up for the rehearsals. He was never there. And it's co-starred Eva Marie Saint and Paul Newman. And Sinatra is magnificent. Sammy Cahn said that he thought it was the finest live performance he ever saw by Frank Sinatra, because that was when television was live. So it was the finest thing he ever saw. At the party, after the airing of the show, Delbert Mann was the director. Delbert Mann wouldn't shake hands with Frank. Wouldn't go near him. He was so appalled. And he said, you were fabulous, but what about the other people? They needed you there in the rehearsal. Eva Marie Saint needed you. Paul Newman needed you. And Sinatra's answer was, I work best the way I work. And if you were going to have Frank Sinatra in a movie, if you were going to have him work for you, that came with it. It really did. So that was part of the problem. The book is very long. It's over 500 pages. I have some reservations. the lack of research bothered me. The errors that are so unnecessary. And I don't understand that, because when I do a book, I'm a research maven. I love to research. I love doing the research. I love getting it right. And I will spend, days to get something if I think I can find what the answer is. He has a lot of mistakes in here that are just egregious, and there's no reason for it. There's no reason for it at all. I'll give you an example. In 1962, Angela Lansbury got the Oscar nomination. He mentions it in there and said, but she lost the award to Margaret Rutherford for the BIPs. No. She lost it to Patty Duke for The Miracle Worker, and that was 62. Margaret Rutherford won, but in 63. You don't make mistakes like that. That's my opinion. He also proceeds to detail the plot of every movie in great, great detail. And I don't understand that. A lot of them are not necessary. We don't need the complete plot of Assault on a Queen or Marriage on the Rocks, okay, or The Kissing Bandit. You just sort of skim over them. You don't need to go into any great detail about those films, because there's not a lot you can say about them. It's best left not mentioned and forget about it, and do the films that are really good. Really concentrate on the magnificent films. And he also has a tendency to speculate. Frank was thinking this. Frank was thinking that. How do we know that? What I would rather have seen him do is delineate the actor, his strengths, his limitations. And I think if he had done that in greater detail, it would have given us a much greater understanding of Sinatra, the actor. He doesn't do that. He's too busy telling us what Frank was thinking. But that, again, there's very few books that have tried to do what he's tried to, done here. And that's to just cover Sinatra as an actor, a Hollywood film actor, a movie star. I would say Sinatra was more a movie star. As I was saying to you earlier, he couldn't get out of being Frank Sinatra. When you saw him on the screen, you saw Frank Sinatra. You didn't see the character, you saw the man. And it's a nice idea. And there's a lot in here that's very interesting. So I wouldn't say you shouldn't read it, because there are fascinating aspects to it. But I do have some reservations, and Joe's aware of that. And I'm going to. This guy is no relation. His name is Daniel O'Brien, but he's nothing. No. But it's published in England. Excuse me. I think it's a much better book, the Frank Sinatra Film Guide. He really gets into every film. He has all of the behind-the-scenes machinations that went into making a Frank Sinatra film, and the problems that they had with Frank Sinatra, and so on. I think this is a much better book. Okay. Some other books I'd recommend that I admire. John Lahr, he's the critic for The New Yorker, and I think this is a fine book. And he covers, it's a biography of Sinatra, and he did a very good job. I helped him with this book, but that's not the reason I'm recommending it. I helped a lot of people with books. My wife, who's over there, can tell you some of the people I helped, and they didn't always, they didn't make the book that came out was not what they said they were going to do, and I'm very disappointed with that. This is a fine book by Bob Willoughby. He passed away last year, and it's basically a pictorial book. And a lot of it is the scenes of the movies. He was there, and he took a lot of candid shots while Sinatra was filming. Films like Can, which is not one of Frank's best films, Can, and Man with the Golden Arm, and so on. It's very nice. Very, very nice book. This is a fabulous book. Again, I helped this individual. His name is Richard Havers. Lives in Scotland. And he did a beautiful book. This came out a couple of years ago. The library has this book. Yeah, the library, well, I'm taking it, so you don't have it anymore. No. The library has the book, and he did a wonderful job. This is beautifully researched, and he does it in chronological order. The beginning of Sinatra's career in 1935, right up through. Covers everything. He went and he found reviews, he interviewed people, and he just really, and it's well done. It's a book I highly recommend to anybody who wants to understand Sinatra, who wants to see what he did in his career and understand the the impact that he had from decade to decade to decade. This is a good book. It's a very good book, and I highly recommend it. So that's a fine, fine book. Now, I just want to see if there's anything else I want to say about the... No, I think that's it there. I think there are 4 films that he made that are timeless, absolutely timeless. From Here to Eternity, The Manchurian Candidate, Suddenly, and On the Town. They're 4 films that hold up. They're all 4-star films. They're all magnificent performances by Sinatra. Everyone else in the film, they're fabulous. But that's it. I think beyond that, he made a lot of good films that I'd recommend. My wife and I love to watch Young at Heart. I don't know how many people like the film Young at Heart, but we love the film Young at Heart. We have a lot of fun with the movie Young at Heart. At the end of the film, Frank is in an automobile accident. In the event anyone hasn't seen it here. And they rush him to the hospital, and Doris Day is his wife. And Doris shows up at the hospital. And Doris was the greatest crier of all time in the history. June Allison might have second billing, but the greatest crier of all time was Doris Day. Nobody could cry like Doris Day. Frank is in the bed, and she goes in, and they're getting him ready. They're prepping him for surgery. He's got huge bandages on his head, and Doris lights a cigarette and puts it in his mouth. Whoa. And this, come on. He recovers. The next scene, he's playing the piano in the house, and Doris is coming down the stairs with their baby. She has announced earlier that she's pregnant, but she announces this just before he has this accident. The baby is huge. This is supposed to be at Easter time. This is the first kid ever on steroids. Okay, you want to see the size. I mean, it's got what I'm trying to say is the movie's got a continuity problem. But it's got wonderful singing by Sinatra. Sinatra did Just One of Those Things, Someone to Watch Over Me, One for My Baby, a song called You My Love, and of course the title song, Young at Heart. During the filming, at the beginning of the filming, Doris's husband, Marty Melcher, was part of the film. And he was trying to hype his songs. And Marty shows up and bugging Frank every day. I want you to try this. And Frank's not going to do Marty's songs. Doris did Marty's songs. Nobody remembers Doris' songs from that movie. They remember Frank's. A week goes by. Marty every day is in there. Sinatra goes and says to Gordon Douglas, the director, me or Marty? I leave, Marty leaves. He had Marty banned from the set for the rest of the film. That was it. Charles Lang was the cinematographer for that film. He was very, very meticulous, took a great deal of time setting up every shot. Sinatra went and said, get rid of him. I want another cinematographer. I want to get this damn thing done. Charles Lang was gone. And this is how he operated. But I think that's a good film. We enjoy that. High Society. The scene with Bing Crosby, when they do Well Did You Ever, and you've got the session right there, the history of the session. It's right on your sheets. It's just one of the great moments musically in the history of cinema. Another one is from Pal Joey. Rita Hayworth comes to visit him in the saloon. And Sinatra, she wants him to sing a song. Sinatra sits down and sings The Lady is a Tramp. And it is so fabulous. And at first, Hayworth is shocked. And then she realizes it's a tribute. He's saying, you're really quite a gal. And that is a great moment in that movie. Just a great movie. Another one is On the Town, when it opens with him singing with Kelly and Jules Munskin, New York, New York. Okay? But that's a very good film. The Joker is wild. He's wonderful as Joey Lewis. He's absolutely wonderful. And the songs that he sings in there, and especially All the Way, which would win the Academy Award for... Now, he was very angry. The Golden Globe gave him Best Actor in a musical or comedy that year, but he was not nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actor. So he wouldn't show up at the Academy Awards and sing All the Way. Peggy Lee subbed for him because he was angry. He felt he eminently deserved the and he did too. He really did. He should have been nominated. But that's a very good film. I enjoy that a great deal. A Hole in the Head. If you like Frank Capra, you like Frank, that's a nice film. Some Came Running, I think, works. Sinatra's very good in that. Shirley MacLaine is very good. And Dean Martin, it's the best performance Dean Martin ever gave in a film. So that's a very good movie. Come Blow Your Horn, The Tender Trap. Of course, The Man with the Golden Arm. So he made a lot of good films. Later, Von Ryan's Express, and I would say the last film that I would say was a good Sinatra film was The Detective in 1968. And I think that was a very, very good movie. And he gave a good performance as Joe Leland, the cop. But again, and here where Frank Sinatra was a movie star. That originally was supposed to be Sidney Lumet as the director. And Lumet, of course, is one of the great directors. And he met with Frank, and he said, I want to do a very gritty film, a very, very gritty film about a New York cop. He said, I don't want you wearing your wig. He said, no makeup, and we're going to rehearse for 2 weeks. Frank walked out of the meeting, turned to one of those people and said, fire him and get Gordon Douglas. Because Frank wanted to be a movie star. And you see the movie, Frank looks like he's 35 years old. He does. The makeup, the wig, and everything. Because that was more important. Because if you were a movie star, your movies made a lot of money. In 1962, Lumet did this with Katharine Hepburn when he filmed Long Day's Journey into Night. And he said, no makeup. We're going to do harsh close-ups. You're supposed to be a woman who's addicted to drugs. He said, we're going to show you in a harsh way. And Hepburn agreed. I think it's the greatest performance in Hepburn's career. Sinatra wouldn't do that. And that's unfortunate, because I think if he had, it would have been a much better movie. Anyway, does anybody have any questions? Yes?
When I was a little girl in New York, they showed a movie in school.
The House I Live In.
Yeah. And I wish they'd show it now, because I think the times then were kind of close to the way they are now. And all of New York City saw the movie. And it was wonderful. Do you think?
It was a 10-minute short. He filmed it in 1945. He received an Academy Award for it. They gave him a special award. They would call it a special achievement. That's what it was. And it's been shown on TCM. TCM has shown it a number of times. It's very good. Yeah, I agree. It's very, very good. It opens with Frank singing If You Are But a Dream, and then he goes out in the alley to get a smoke between records. And there's a bunch of kids beating up other kids. And it's about racial tolerance, religious tolerance. And he believed in that very, very much. And he went around to schools all over the country and preached that, because it was so important to him. He believed that all Americans, and later on, he would be one of the first people that if an African American was in a band and Frank Sinatra was playing someplace, that African American stayed in the same hotel. He ate in the same restaurant. And he did this in Vegas. He did it in Miami. He did it wherever he went. He broke down baloney. You didn't do this. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. couldn't play certain clubs. Frank Sinatra took care of it. Sammy Davis Jr. played those clubs. It wasn't going to happen. He didn't believe in that. He was colorblind. It was that simple. He just didn't believe in it. But I agree with you. It's a very fine.
When was that made?
1945.
Is it on any disc or anything like that?
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe it's available. But TCM does show it. I've seen it 4 or 5 times on TCM.
What's the name of it again?
The House I Live In. Yeah, 10 minutes short.
And the song.
Yes.
Clint Eastwood was quoted recently that it's better to be a director rather than going into politics, because a director is really a benign dictator.
Mm-hmm.
Did Sinatra direct any pictures?
One. He directed None But the Brave, which was made in 1964.
Why didn't he go in sort of the Eastwood direction as a director?
That's a good question. The movie received mixed reviews. It was filmed in Hawaii. Sinatra almost died. He was out swimming, and he got caught, and the tide pulled him out. And an actor who was in the film ran in and saved him, named Brad Dexter. And Brad Dexter, by doing this, all of a sudden became a very important person in Frank Sinatra's life. And Frank Sinatra did not thank him, because Frank Sinatra didn't thank people. What he did is he gave him a position in Frank Sinatra Enterprises. He started producing movies for Frank Sinatra, because he grabbed Frank and pulled Frank out of the way. And okay, but that's the only directorial effort he made, and it received mixed reviews. But you mentioned Eastwood. I imagine Eastwood probably sent Frank Sinatra a card every Christmas after 1970, because Frank signed to be Dirty Harry. He had the role, Harry Callahan. It was Frank. They did the wardrobe. They had it all set up, and he developed a problem in his hand, his right hand. It was atrophied, the muscles, and it had caused so much pain. His hand was going. They had to operate, and he had to drop out of the film. And Clint Eastwood became Dirty Harry. And he makes the point in here a number of times. He's convinced that Sinatra would have been a great Harry Callahan, and it was a loss. The other thing he mentions in here is he considers one of the great losses the movie Carousel. Frank signed to play Billy Bigelow in 1955 in Carousel. He did the pre-recordings, he did all the wardrobe, and he flew to Booth Bay, Maine, and for 3 days he filmed the scene for Soliloquy. I'm sure some of you know that song. Magnificent recording by Sinatra. And then Frank found out that they were filming it in 35 millimeter and 70 millimeter. And Frank went and said, ain't gonna happen. I'm not doing 2 movies. And he said, well, you're not doing 2. He said, I'm doing 2 movies. And he said, I'm a 1-take guy. He said, I'm not doing 2 takes. And he dropped out. And Gordon McRae did the role. Now, I saw Shirley Jones on AMC maybe 20 years ago. Professor Richard Brown had a show on AMC. And he asked her about that movie. And she said she is convinced that that was not the reason Sinatra dropped out. She said he was just intimidated, the idea of playing Billy Bigelow, because Billy Bigelow was a big roustabout. On Broadway, it was John Raitt, and in the film, Gordon McRae. These are big men. Frank Sinatra was not a big man. And she said that's her opinion. But she said the movie was good. If Frank Sinatra had starred in it, it would have been great. And he says the same thing. Now, the year before, Frank Sinatra signed to be part of an animated cartoon soundtrack with Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Red Norvo, Oscar Peterson, David Wayne. He did all the pre-recordings for the only studio recording he ever did with Louis Armstrong, only studio recording he ever did with Ella Fitzgerald. And I interviewed everyone involved in that project. It was very, very hard to get the information because it involved the House Un-American Activities Committee. John Hubley, the animated cartoonist who was making it, was a fellow traveler. And one day they went to lunch in January of 1954, and when they came back, the government had put padlocks on the door. And that was the end of Finian's Rainbow. And Sinatra had done everything. He had done all of his dialogue. He was playing Woody in Finian's Rainbow. Now, I interviewed Burton Lane, who wrote the music for Finian's Rainbow. And he was a wonderful man. And I had a delightful conversation with him. And he told me that Yip Harburg, who wrote the lyrics, was appalled at the recordings when he first heard them, because they were very jazzy. No one had ever done these songs that way. He was appalled. He said, but as they aged, and the more he heard them, Harburg fell in love with them. And Lane said to me, it was one of the great tragedies of my life that never happened. And I thought that was wonderful. And of course, he wrote wonderful songs. One of the best songs in there is Old Devil Moon, which Sinatra did with Ella Logan, and it runs 8.5 minutes. Does anybody else have a, yes?
Frank was a womanizer.
No.
What woman actually tamed him?
I don't think any woman ever tamed him. None. I think the great love of his life, without any question, was Ava Gardner. His valet, George Jacobs, told me that when he was recording the Wee Small Hours album, he was telling Jacobs and a few other close friends, it's the Ava album. It's an album of unrequited love, 16 songs, magnificent concept, just a magnificent concept, and Nelson Riddle. And I think it's the finest album ever recorded, ballad album, by anyone. Anyone. And I challenge anyone to show me something that's better. That is so magnificent an album. And, but I don't think so, no. No woman could tame Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, he was engaged to Lauren Bacall, and she told someone that they were going to get married, and he broke it off just like that. Juliet Prowse, he wanted her to give up her career. She wouldn't do it. He forget it, it's over. The only one was Ava Gardner. And Ava Gardner couldn't tame him. She was so much like him. All they did was fight. And they had legendary fights. I mean, it was in the headlines of the paper and everything, but he always loved her. And right up until the end, she died the day before he played the Nick Arena in Albany in 1990. She died on January 29th. He was in New York at the Waldorf Astoria. He went into his room and he closed the door and he didn't come out for 24 hours. He didn't eat, he didn't drink, and he didn't talk to anyone. Nothing. And then he came out, said, let's go, and he came up to Albany, New York, and played to over 18,000 people, which is still the all-time record for the Nick Pepsi Times Union Arena. So, anyone else? Yes?
What do you think of the Pete Hamill?
I'm sorry?
The Pete Hamill?
Pete Hamill, yes, Why Sinatra Matters. It's a very good book. I think it's very good. Hamill in 1975 rode around with Frank in his limo. And they went up through Central Park and through Manhattan. And Frank just talked. And Hamill listened. And he was very frustrated because he was going around the country appearing in concert and playing to sellout crowds. He was filling stadiums. 24, 30, 35,000 people, but his records were not selling the way that they used to sell. And he kept saying to Hamill, why does Elton John sell these records, but I outdraw him in concert? And Hamill tried to explain to him, it's a different audience. Older people are not that interested in buying the records so much, but they want to see you. They want to be there. They want to see you in concert. He started talking about his mother and his childhood, and so on. And Hamill got the idea this would be a great thing to do. And I think it's a very good book. Very good book. He gives a lot of insights into Sinatra. And I admired him. It's obviously admired him tremendously. But it made me think of something. Ava Gardner. In 1975, Sinatra was in a bar in New York with Joe Raposo. And Joe Raposo had written 5 songs for Sinatra for the album Old Blue Eyes Is Back. And they were sitting there talking, and the name of Ava came up. Sinatra turned and he looked at him, and he said, you can't imagine how beautiful she was. That's all he said. You can't imagine how beautiful she was. And he got up and he left. And Raposo told that to a good friend of mine. And I think that's fascinating. Anybody else? Yes?
The movie Some Like It Hot, the classic comedy, Marilyn Monroe, Jack Lemmon. I understood Frank was going to make that with Mitzi Gaynor and
Danny Kaye. Yep. Frank had the Tony Curtis role.
That probably would
Yep.
have been
Well, I'll read something to you here. This is what Billy Wilder said about Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra is beyond talent. It is some sort of magnetism that goes in higher revolutions than that of anybody else in the whole of show business. There is a certain electricity permeating the air. It's like Mac the Knife is in town and the action is starting. That's Billy Wilder. That's his take on Frank. Would it have been as good a movie? I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I think Curtis latching on to the idea of doing Cary Grant when he's seducing Monroe would never have happened with Frank. And, you know, AFI 2 years ago picked it the funniest movie ever made. I don't think it would have. Danny Kaye, I can see him in the Jack Lemmon role, but I just don't think it would have been as good a movie. It wouldn't have worked as well. But you can go on naming the films that Sinatra was supposed to do. In 1946, he was going to star in Jumbo with the great Rodgers and Hart songs, and his co-star was going to be Judy Garland and Jimmy Durante. It fell through. Then he was going, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, it was going to be Judy Garland, not Esther Williams. Now imagine what that would have been like. Then he was going to do In the Good Old Summertime with Judy Garland. And that would have been, I mean, Sinatra and Garland never worked together in the film. So it would have been terrific. But there were a lot of, in the 1950s and 60s, there were so many projects that were set to go and then never happened. In 1964, they were going to do a biopic of Irving Berlin. And it was called Say It With Music. His co-star was Julie Andrews, all that magnificent Berlin music, and the director was Vincent Minnelli. And Arthur Freed was producing it. And they started thinking, well, you know, musicals just, they're not making money anymore. The next year, The Sound of Music. But they didn't know. Anyone else?
Thanks, Ed, for coming. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
It's like one of our